Fantastic. Well, as I said, thank you all so much for joining us on this lovely Saturday slash Sunday for one of our presenters. And we are very excited to have Professor Benjamin Mountford and Professor Stephen Tuffnell from the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne and the University of Oxford, respectively, to talk about their book, A Global History of Gold Rushes. We are very excited to be able to present this program as next week we open our latest exhibit over at the Sheldon Peck Homestead, all about Charles Peck, who he himself was a 49er who went west. So we are very grateful for both of them to give us a fantastic overview on just what makes gold so special and what drove countless people around the world to pack up their lives, head, far away, or if they're fortunate, stay very close to, search that very elusive, precious metal. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our presenters. As a reminder, please make sure that unless you are speaking, that you remain on mute. And if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we will have some time for question and answer at the end. So with that, thank you, gentlemen, so much.
Thanks very much, Ray, and hi, everyone. Welcome to the session. On behalf of myself and Professor Tuffnell, let me just thank Ray, particularly, who's been organising this event today across 3 continents, which is never an easy thing to do. And we've just had a couple of Zoom issues this morning, which we've sorted out just in time. So thanks for your patience. We'd also like to thank the Lombard Historical Society for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here to present for you. Just to, I suppose, start with a little bit of context. So I'm coming to you from, as Ray said, just near Melbourne in Australia, a town called Ballarat, which was one of the centres of Australia's gold rush, which unfolded just a few years after the rush to California. There's a Ballarat in Death Valley named after the city where I'm sitting, where miners travelled in the United States, the same way that the sort of names of California had spread across the world after the gold rush, the names of places in my part of the world travelled as well as miners shifted around the globe. Steve is joining you from Oxford, so we're sort of juggling the time zones. I'm coming to you from Australia, but also from the future. It's very early Sunday morning over here. And Steve and I were delighted to come and talk to you today about a topic, I guess, that we've been interested in for a long time and first started working on a few years back with our book, A Global History of Gold Rushes, but have a bit like the miners who sort of can't give up chasing the gold. We seem to keep coming back for it, looking for new insights and stories, and certainly to hear some of the background to Charles Peck and his experience as a 49er is a really fascinating aspect of it for us. Steve, is there anything you wanted to add before we sort of jump in and start talking about the book?
No, I don't think so right now. We can do the broad overview, and then yeah, I'm looking forward to the chat at the end.
Great, folks. So what I'll do, I'll share my screen in a moment. We've got, of course, one of the joys of talking about gold rush history is the amazing visual images and materials that we have to go with it. So I'll share my screen in just a second, but let me just acknowledge it's traditional here in Australia to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're joining from. So I'm joining from the lands of the Dja people here in Creswick in Victoria. Ballarat, where my university is based, just up the road, is on the lands of the Wadawurrung people. And so what I'll do, let me share my screen for you. I'll just pop up a PowerPoint here. Can I just check that's coming through okay? Ray, bouncing across 3 continents, the wonders of technology. Okay, great. And so folks, here's our cover for the book that we're going to talk about. And I guess what Steve and I thought we might do today is sort of speak to some sections in the book that we talk about, and then we'll pause and sort of talk to some of the slides that we're going to show you as well. And I suppose really the crux of the book that we were interested in exploring is many of you, of course, will know the story of California, the discovery as Marshall looked down at his boot in 1848 and saw the speckle of gold in the race that he was digging at Sutter's Mill, and then how that unfolds into a global story, particularly through 1849 with the Great Rush to California. But what Steve and I were interested in exploring with our team of collaborators was the way in which that's really the start of a sequence of gold rushes that unfold across the world. And so that's really the focus of the book. So let me just, I'll turn to the book here a little bit for you, and then we'll work through the story as we go. Nothing set the world in motion like gold. Between 1848 and the turn of the 20th century, the global rush to find and extract the precious metal from the earth in previously unimaginable quantities inspired a dramatic burst of movement and energy, affecting the course of world history. In California and then across the Pacific Rim and parts of Africa, gold discoveries and the rushes that followed birthed new territories and states, triggered short-term booms and busts, provoked violent conflict with local Indigenous and other resident communities, sparked entrepreneurship of all kinds, reordered production, trade and labour, exposed humankind's capacity to alter the natural world, and created new hierarchies of difference and disconnection. These transformations took place on a global stage as capital, people, and raw materials connected distant areas of the world in a spontaneous, contagious search for gold. And the first of our sort of fun sources we wanted to show you here is known as The Way They Go to California. And you can see here the sort of range of hilariously improvised techniques that you use to get there by any means possible. And many of you know that idea of gold fever. And this is really, a symptom that you see emerging all over the world in this period. And contemporaries at the time, they agonized over the frenetic energy and the social dislocation and this runaway growth that seemed to be being triggered by the gold rushes. And it was natural in a sense that they reached for the best metaphor that they knew, this idea of diseases, fevers, or epidemics. From California, one correspondent was suddenly attacked with violent, extraordinary symptoms, explaining that it was a temporary fit of delirium brought on by a new epidemic, the yellow or gold fever. Closer to where I am here in Sydney, which of course was just across the Pacific from San Francisco, working men began packing up and leaving for California. And one of the townspeople complained that he'd been completely bit by the gold fever, that he'd basically lost all his senses and had to do everything he could do to get to California. Gold fever was said to infect naive greenhorns, rage across prairies, oceans, and continents, and ravage town and city alike through depopulation. Fever captured the connected nature of the phenomenon many people found themselves in, but also the widespread anxiety produced by gold rushes and the sense that a type of irrationality propelled them. Like illness, gold mining was a gamble. Luck, rather than the diligence or virtue of the individual, determined the outcome. But of course, this was also part of the allure which kept many miners at work. A man never knows when he's going to pick up the rarest nugget in the world, wrote one Klondiker. I may find it tomorrow, and I probably will not find it more than a few cents. And I'm likely to find a shaft full of water. So gold seemed to offer equal measures of promise and peril at the same time. The touch of unlimited gold dissolves society into its elements and produces a total disorganization, wrote one of the Melbourne newspapers from just near where I am. The effects of it defy conjecture. So this idea of gold sort of unpinning the structures of society, of unpinning the traditions and ideas that people took for granted in their everyday life. And it was really this sense, I guess, that Steve and I wanted to understand more as a global phenomenon, not just something that happened in California or Colorado or even here in southeastern Australia, but something that really started to unfold as a global phenomenon during the second half of the 19th century. And I should start by saying that our map here is really a very select map. We could have added a whole lot more dots were we trying not to squeeze them into the frontispiece of a little book, but we had to be a bit selective. But you can see even here the number of these gold rushes which are unfolding. And it's no surprise, really, I think, that gold rushes left contemporaries slightly delirious. The second half of the 19th century was convulsed by repeated and overlapping gold rushes. California in 1848 and 49, Victoria and New South Wales in 1851 were just the beginning. Between them, the Western American states of Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana experienced some 40 gold rushes. Nevada and California, meanwhile, remained in a state of almost constant gold and mineral discovery through the second half of the 19th century. Here in Australia, between 1851 and 1894, there were roughly 28 gold rushes, depending on which historian you decide to follow. In the decade beginning in 1857, 5 of New Zealand's provinces, Nelson, Otago, Marlborough, Canterbury, and Auckland, experienced gold rushes. In 1868, gold was even discovered on the bed of a river in Lapland, triggering a rush to that region, which only peaked in 1872. After the famous Witwatersrand gold rush in southern Africa in 1886, geologists scoured southern Rhodesia, where a rush began in the 1890s, and the Gold Coast, where there was a period of rushes between the 1870s and 1900 for the next great bonanza. The Klondike Gold Rush, which will be no doubt familiar to many members of the audience, at the end of the 19th century in Yukon Territory, was just the latest of a series of rushes in present-day Canada, following the rush to Fraser River in British Columbia, which started in 1858. So there's this sort of constant sequence of gold rushes moving around the world and unfolding in this continuous story, rather than just, I suppose, those iconic gold rushes that we think of. They're really the touchstones, but then they set off this sequence of gold discovery right around the world. And of course, as these gold discoveries develop, the earth starts to yield increasing amounts of riches and gold production races upwards. In the first half of the 19th century, the annual world output of gold ranged between 10 and 20 tonnes. But after the strikes to California and Victoria, the figure had leapt to 180 tonnes. By the start of the 20th century, it had reached 450 tonnes per year. Put another way, as the historian May Nye has explained, in the 50 years between California and the Klondike, more gold was mined from the earth than in the previous 3 millennia, which is startling when you think of the transformative effect of this discovery of the precious mineral. In 1902, and this gives you a sense, just to give you another snapshot of how widespread these things were. One of our favourite sources, I think, is a book published in 1902 called The Gold Mines of the World. And it was written by the mining editor for The Economist, the mining correspondent, very well-respected writer. And just to give you a sense of how widely spread these gold mines are, after visiting the Transvaal, Rhodesia, of course, present-day Zimbabwe, India, the Malay Peninsula, Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and acknowledging his desire to one day visit gold mines in Russia, China, Japan, Korea, the Dutch East Indies, Hungary, and South and Central America, James Herbert Curler, this correspondent for The Economist, calculated that gold was adding roughly 70 million pounds annually to the world economy. And it's a wonderful book because it's got about all these chapters on these different places, but he begins with this enormous apology for the gold mines he hasn't been able to get to, even though you sort of can't imagine there could be any more than the ones he talks about. And I suppose one of the things we were fascinated about is, of course, as well as generating all these gold and these wonderful stories, these really fascinating historical transformations, the gold rushes also added a huge amount of writing and material to our understanding of literary society during this period. Gold rushes were as much cultural watersheds as they were economic watersheds. At the mines and in the rare pauses between the swish and the swish of the pan, the crunch of the shovel and the crash of the battery, if you listen carefully, you might have heard a furious scratching of pens and pencils on paper. Contemporary diarists, journalists, boosters and administrators, as well as many others, recorded the awe, excitement, dread and frustration of the dogged quest for gold. An incredible total of 285 emigrants' guides, cheap literary melodramas and pamphlets about Gold Rush California and travel to the goldfields had appeared in print by 1860. So in that sort of 11 years, 285 books about what to do in California, which is pretty remarkable. Less than a decade after the beginning of the rush to Victoria, here in Eastern Australia, books on this gold-rich British colony had been published in German, French, Swedish, Norwegian, and Italian, alongside the numerous English language volumes piling up in London. And from mid-century, the rushes to California and Australia also captured the attention of the great thinkers and political economists of the age. Everyone from Richard Cobden to Karl Marx were writing about what the increase in the gold supply would do to the world's economy and to the fate of its people. Gold had been valued as an object of pure value, of course, right across human history, going back to the ancient world. But in no other century did it sit at the centre of so many heated public debates over its cultural, political, economic, and even its religious significance. Each rush encouraged a flurry of academic, popular, and personal writing, technical, celebratory, and anxious, widely accessible and familiar to historians. And we've chosen, two of the thousands of examples we could have used here. On the right, the gold mines of the world that I mentioned before, and on the left, probably a slightly more racy volume, The Romance of Mining by Archibald Williams. But it sort of shows the different audiences to which these publications were appealing. And so I guess it was these sort of ideas that we took into our book. We wanted to think about the global dimensions of the gold rushes, not just how California and Victoria and these other great gold rushes drew people from around the world and a series of different influences from around the world, but also how they set in motion this kind of chain of gold rushes. So when gold is found here, for instance, in 1851, if you look at the letters of 49ers who were in California at the time, the news arrives that there's gold in Australia, and some of them decide to keep pushing west. So that they've traveled from the United States to the West Coast. They've maybe had some success enough to keep their capital going, and they decide, I'm going to keep pushing west to Australia in the hope that I'll do better there. And from Australia, we've got people that then go on to New Zealand, go on to British Columbia. And so this sort of wave of gold rushing and travel continues. And so the idea, I guess, was to get together a team of historians who are specialists in these different parts of the world, who are specialists in thinking about some of the factors that underpin the story of the gold rushes, and to collect a series of essays thinking about, I suppose, firstly, how are gold rushes global events? And then secondly, how do they shape the global history of the world in the 19th century, that sort of crucial period of global connection? And really what we want to do, I think, is talk a little bit about looking back at some of these great historic sources. Here's San Francisco Bay in 1851. You can see the sort of forest of ships' masts out there in the harbour. Of course, the crews have abandoned ship to run off for the digging, so the ships end up stranded in the harbour. If you visit San Francisco, of course, there's the wonderful museum in town which sort of records where the hulls of these ships are sitting under the contemporary city, where they're abandoned and sunk into the mud and form the foundations of some of the city. But this idea, I guess, of cities like San Francisco's as gold rush gateways is the idea that we've been exploring. They become that pathway in to these gold rush communities. I think also, and this is a really interesting way, I think, of talking about how history reflects our contemporary concerns and ideas. There's globalization and global connection in terms of trade and migration are obviously issues that we're very interested in our contemporary lives, but others too, like environmental history. So weighing the economic benefits of the gold rush versus the environmental damage that was done, and the costs that were associated at the time. Often today, of course, with remediating some of the sites that were affected by chemicals or by environmental damage during the mining. So the history of the gold rush, I think, is a really interesting way in understanding some of these key phenomena. And for me, I think before I pass to Steve, I think one of the reasons I'm really fascinated by this period is because I think when you study the history of the gold rush, and someone like Charles Peck, I think, is a great example here. You see these people going through a scale of tremendous change on a level that we can probably relate to. You know, we're living in an era of tremendous technological change, of change in the way that we live our lives, of how we work, how we learn, how we you know, the fact we're sitting here on Zoom is of course a great example of this. And I think there's something about the gold rush period and the scale of the change that people's lives are going through that I think speaks to us today in really new and interesting ways. And with that, I might pass to my colleague there in the UK, if that's okay, Steve.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Ben. And I think what we wanted to do for the rest of the talk then was maybe take a bit of a bird's eye view of some of those kind of global processes and changes that are really the signature of this period of intensive gold rushing, and that probably will look in many respects quite familiar in the modern world, which is marked by similar patterns of large scale mobility, travel, and exchange of people, goods, and ideas across long distances. But we see them being accelerated and particularly accentuated, I think, through the phenomena of gold rushing. But I think one of the things too that's interesting about them is that the gold rushes they have a kind of cultural allure about them. But you could pick other metals and raw materials or minerals in the same century that produce Russian phenomena too, whether that's copper, coal, perhaps less like a rush there, but still mobilizes huge amounts of resources and people. And then things that are less familiar, like guano, which is bird poo rich in nitrates, used for fertilizer, and gutta percha, which is the kind of rubber that goes around the kind of cables, the transatlantic, transpacific cables that are connecting the world. But gold, it stood out to contemporaries, and I think that's what kind of interested us most. And one of the things that most stood out to contemporaries was how gold rushes were events of enormous human migration in an era of enormous human migrations. So in 1849, as the cartoon on the slide here reflects, which is from London Punch, which is a sort of satirical magazine, published weekly, but you have a similar kind of satirical art style to the Courier and Ives print that we saw earlier of how people got to California on jetpacks and steam-powered hot air balloons. Here we have the California movement as seen from London, which captured the kind of prevailing excitement that everything, quote, this is the caption for the cartoon, everything that will float and a great deal that will not is being advertised for California. So by any estimation, the scale of gold rush migration is quite remarkable. Gold rush has dramatically accelerated demographic expansion in the places they touched down. So in 1848, California's non-Indian population was around 14,000, and it soared to almost 100,000 by the end of 1849, and to 300,000 then by the end of 1853. And across the Pacific, in Victoria, near Bend, the population grew from slightly more, 77,000 at the start of the gold rushes in 1851 to 411,000 just 6 years later. Some 30,000, mainly Californians, flocked to the British Columbian mainland after the discovery of gold there in 1858. And thanks largely to the gold rushes too, New Zealand's non-Maori population almost doubles in the years 1861 to 64, from 98,000 to 171,000. And these figures can go on, and I'll try not to list them ad infinitum, but you see it again in South Africa, where the Transvaal's white population of 40,000 in 1879 reaches nearly 500,000 by 1911. And in the Klondike, even in the Klondike too, the last great rush, which is really the final rush of the volume really takes on, you see a similarly remarkable influx to a quite remote region, perhaps as many as 100,000 people. Now, by the time they had arrived, the average Klondiker had travelled themselves more than 2,500 miles and devoted $1,000 to transport and supplies. So there's a bit of an insight there too into who these people are. And to take the Charles Peck example again, before we began the talk, Ray was telling me that he began the journey to California with his brother and another family. So these are mostly in contrast to the well-known figure of the kind of lone prospector the single-minded gold miner with a pick and a pan. Actually, these are people who mostly work in companies, often family or often from a local place, where they're pooling resources because it requires an enormous amount of capital to buy the material needed either to cross the continental United States, whether you would need a cart or at least, or preferably a wagon. And then there's all the kit that you might need to extract the gold, and much of which canny suppliers are exaggerating the extent to which you'll need and also inflating the prices. So they tend to be middle-class Americans fleeing what they consider the kind of slavery of wage labor, and often they've been working as clerks, or they've been undertaking kind of fairly backbreaking work in other industries, and so that gold offers an exit from what they see as the kind of drudgery of wage labor in some respects. Now what also is interesting about these people, and the average Klondiker may have traveled 2,500 miles, but some of those Klondikers will have traveled even more because of the sequential nature of the gold-seeking experience during the 19th century, which enables a cohort of global gold seekers to follow the gold trail kind of around the Pacific and beyond. So as each new discovery is announced, they in turn inherit some of the characteristics of their predecessors, and they pass on new features to their successors. And the vectors of those characteristics are the gold miners themselves who are traveling from place to place. Now, this phenomenon has probably best been captured by historians of New Zealand, from where gold seekers had traveled to California and Australia, and which itself drew in miners when gold was found in the later 1850s and 60s. So the discoverer of Gabriel's Gully, one of those sites, which triggered the Otago gold rush, John Salmon, the historian explains, was an Australian who had learnt his craft in California. The man who found gold in Coromandel had served his apprenticeship on the Sacramento River, and the pioneer of the Aurora field had acquired his prospecting techniques in Victoria, Australia. And the rush to Molyneux finally followed the finds of Hartley and Riley from San Francisco. So commenting on the mid-century rushes, another historian of New Zealand, Philip Ross May, pondered whether historians of the gold rush were not dealing with Californian or Victorian or New Zealand colonists, but with a variety of the genus Pacific man, whose habitat is no particular country, but the gold fields themselves. So heroic narratives of the gold rushes have come under increasing scrutiny then in recent years, in spite of the scale of these figures and the stories of individual prowess or acumen that is driving these, and good fortune, frankly, that is driving these rushes. And so many historians have begun to focus on the neglected presence of women, of children, and of indigenous peoples and other incoming minority communities into those areas. So those previous figures were the known figures of largely Anglo and white miners recorded in the census data in those places. Nevertheless, we ought to recognize that on the gold fields of the Anglo settler societies of the Pacific Rim, British, American, and other European miners did predominate and had their own categories of gender, race, and nationality to fit into. And one of those is something that another historian called James Bellich has called kind of crew culture. So this is an amorphous, masculine, kind of Anglo collective identity that was redirected from the world of maritime labor onto the gold fields. And this collective identity was an antitype, really, born of these white men's negotiation of and their violent interactions with the alchemy of peoples and migrants resident and laboring on the gold fields. So if you think back to the image Ben showed of San Francisco Harbor with the ships in the bay there, that's properly understood, and I think probably correctly understood, to be filled with the kind of rotting remains of what was the United States Pacific whaling fleet and Pacific trading fleet, that on news of gold reaching the Pacific, those captains turned back or turned on their sterns, as it were, and landed in San Francisco instead. So what you have here is the decline of the United States China trade, which it used to dominate before 1848, and the rise of the United States as this sort of major gold rush destination, and that most of the crews have jumped ship and taken with them the culture of the ships into those places. The gold miners will have learned that culture in other ways too. So one of the most common ways of getting to a gold field, to the California gold field, would be to work your passage on a ship as you go around the Cape Horn, in lieu of paying for all that kit or a wagon, or of pooling resources in a company, and before the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in Nicaragua that enables them to cross the isthmus without the dangerous passage around the Horn. So those values are spread quite easily and quite rapidly from ship to shore in that respect. You do see on the gold fields then this alchemy of peoples drawn in from lots of different places. So here is JCF Johnson's kind of portrait of miners playing cards around 1867, but you have a Chinese miner, an Anglo miner, and possibly an Aboriginal miner or a black miner who's travelled from overseas into the region there. And few gold seekers fail to be fascinated by the cosmopolitan nature of the mining communities and by the relationships that developed between these diverse groups of diggers in mining towns and camps. So from 1848, the rush for gold drew in fortune seekers from around the globe, and not only from those Anglo send-in societies such as the United States and Great Britain and Australia. And such were the multinational origins of the gold seekers of California, writes one historian, that the common denominator uniting them was really that they came from all over the world. So they came from Mexico and the Hawaiian Islands. Some of the first miners to arrive in California after news of the discovery came from Chile and Peru, and from borderland areas like Sonora in northern Mexico and elsewhere in South and Central America. And they came from Australia and New Zealand and from southeastern China, of course, but also from Western and Eastern Europe. Arrivals who made their way to the Golden State to join California Indians, Californios, and those Americans arriving from the east over land and sea. So in her vivid account of California, Indoors and Out, published in 1856, Eliza Farnham was struck by this cosmopolitanism, writing that armies of men, sustained through successive disappointments and fearful sufferings by the hope which first drew them together, among these incongruous battalia represented the hopes of the world, benighted Africa, despotic Asia, restless Europe, complacent America, sit down side by side in these treasure houses of nature. Now, the progress of this polyglot community assembled in the creeks and riverbeds of California, Farnham predicted would resonate out across the oceans, and subsequent rushes also attracted diverse minority communities alongside white miners. And I think thanks to the work of Maynai especially, but also others before her, we know that amongst those cosmopolitan mobile peoples, Chinese miners probably constituted a bit more than a quarter of the total of global gold rush migration. Now, the presence of such significant numbers of Chinese miners speaks to the larger global and imperial drama, of which the gold rushes were merely one, but a compelling subplot. So by mid-century, Western intervention, lawlessness, overpopulation, and the impact of domestic rebellions in China had destabilized its southern coastal provinces. And as word arrived of the fabulous riches available at the in California, which they called Old Gold Mountain, and the New Gold Mountain, which was Australia, through the western portals of Hong Kong and Amoy, now Xiamen, outward-looking and enterprising young men set out from their villages, also often in companies, working collectively. And ironically, it was the new treaty powers that provided much of the system, the structure, and the apparatus for the millions of migrants who left Guangdong and Fujian after the mid-19th century and made their way to California. Now, the presence of these people played powerfully on the economic and cultural anxieties of the white miners we've also been talking about. So it's no surprise, by 1850 in California, you have the first foreign miners tax, which is an attempt to push incoming miners out of the lucrative districts in the southern goldfields and the northern goldfields onto the edges where the alluvial gold was found in smaller quantities. So the racism that developed towards minority communities on all the 19th century goldfields usually found its most potent expression in a virulent xenophobia, which inspired visions of a white Pacific and sped the erection of so-called Great White Walls against Chinese migration, which is really is a large part of the story of Californian domestic politics throughout what we call the Gilded Age, I suppose the 1870s. That is the Chinese exclusion movement, which is in large part rooted in the transformations that come with gold. Well, the other part of that story is that none of the miners or invaders, Western or Chinese, were arriving into unoccupied territories. Now, the global circuits that kind of meet on the gold rush, in kind of the gold fields of the gold rushes, had catastrophic impacts on indigenous communities. So while the appearance of gold seekers might present new opportunities for employment and trade, the miners and their followers also brought death and destruction through disease, through endemic violence, and through environmental cataclysm. So recent scholarship has emphasized the enduring presence of indigenous people at the rushes and their contributions to the economic and social worlds of the mining camps. But in one recent estimate, as many as 4,000 Californian Indians worked in the central mines by the end of 1848, many of them because newcomers had shot or driven off game and ravaged traditional Californian Indian economies. So they're being pushed into the world of wage labor on the minefields. This was especially, I think, magnified in Southern Africa, which is a mineral field that features quite frequently in the book, where the dynamics are different. It's less about the persistence of indigenous laborers than it is the systematic exploitation of their labor. So the discovery of the main reef of gold there in 1886 completely redraws the economic patterns across the subcontinent of Southern Africa. Now, initially, Black African laborers migrate to the mines for limited wage employment, and as a means of gaining some independence from what were sometimes seen as quite stifling hierarchical societies for young men who are struggling as those groups have been pushed off traditional agricultural and pastoral lands. But under the combined pressures then of colonial taxation, of land dispossession, and of the ecological degradation that comes with mining and the intensive farming of settler imperialism there, many Black Africans then had little choice other than to seek work in the new industrial mining centres around Johannesburg. So by 1910, that's just about 24 years after the gold rush there, the gold mine industry had created a coercive labour system that delivered 200,000 unskilled Black workers annually to the mines from as far north as Central Africa. So there is a much more systematized, more highly capitalized system of labor exploitation. And California, as in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, indigenous knowledge was coveted by the gold hungry newcomers before subsequently being reclaimed as settler intuition. So in New Zealand, Maori miners' ability to seek out new finds was widely respected by the rushers, while at the Klondike, First Nations people, one pictured here from the Tlingit nation, were much in demand for their skills and their ability to navigate the rugged terrain with large packs. So the Tlingit people, for example, from the Pacific Northwest coast, had long controlled routes into the interior, the sort of middleman between interior groups producing furs for external markets and the indigenous traders on the coast who are trading with fur companies from the United States and Canada. So their knowledge becomes coveted by the rushers. So the Raven clan of the village of Chilcut, south of Dyea, had a monopoly on the Chilcut Pass until the 1880s. But as the rush for gold gathered pace, they subsequently allowed miners to use the route. So that's a really famous image, which we probably should have had on the slides, that's memorialized in Charlie Chaplin's film about mining the Klondike, of the kind of ant-like people traveling up the Chilcut Pass, kind of narrow valley between two mountains that enables access, not actually to the gold fields, but to a river that will finally get you to the gold fields. But the miners are only able to get through that because of the skill of the Tlingit peoples navigating that treacherous way. So these interventions, I think, have corrected years of omission from the story. I think what we found from working with the kind of group of scholars that we assembled was that that collective work has not done much to overturn the ongoing impression that the gold rushes encapsulated a type of violence against the original inhabitants of those places. So in California, to take the example that's most well known, the gold rush accelerated changes and challenges already being confronted by Californian Indian tribes, which they'd experienced through previous decades of colonization by Spaniards, Russians, and Mexicans. Between the late 1760s and 1846, just the eve of the discovery of gold, the Californian Indian population was already in decline, falling from perhaps 310,000 people to about half that amount, 150,000. Under US rule, California Indians died at an even more astonishing pace, largely thanks to the influx of the gold rushes, which amplify processes already underway. So disease, dislocation, starvation caused many deaths, and more lethally, as Benjamin Madley has described in a recent book, was the apparatus of genocide erected in the state that enabled the organized destruction of Californian Indians. So this is vigilante groups being employed by local communities to remove Indians from particular areas to gain access to not just gold, but other resources, but that the settlement of gold really amplifies the tragedy there. And in Australia, gold itself intensifies earlier patterns of pastoralist expropriation and violence against the colony's indigenous people. After the first strikes in central Victoria, 10,000 diggers sweep down upon Barker's Creek, Mount Alexander, and the Dja Dja Wurrung's traditional hunting and camping grounds. Creeks and streams are dammed or become alluvial sites. Timber is felled in large quantities, and wildlife is shot or driven away. So the earth is really hollowed out and turned inside out, which is one of the major impacts that is still felt today in these gold rush places. Another key part then of that story of the rushes and a development on who they are is that these populations are overwhelmingly male. According to the census of 1850 in California, the population is 92% male. In the colony of Victoria, even by 1861, men aged between 21 and 45 outnumber women by a margin of 2 to 1. This has two effects, really. It alters the division of labor on mining camps. So reading some of the diaries and actually from supervising some undergraduate dissertations here, you find that the companies of men that are traveling to the goldfields and working in the goldfields start to organize labor in new ways, and the men start to take on domestic tasks, such as cooking and cleaning and caring for the sick, which is something that they're unused to. And so the diaries are full of interesting reflections on what that means for their manhood. Now, for the women left, but there's a story too about the gold rushes, which I think needs more filling out, which is about their impact on the sending societies where these men leave. For the women who they've left behind, often wives, mothers, sisters, or dependents, this fundamentally alters the way they work. So they're often told, these are people often told gold rush widows or women in waiting or grass widows, as they're known in Victoria in Australia. Now, these are women left behind to manage households, farms, and businesses. To make ends meet, they would have to take in boarders or teach local children while they waited for remittances from the diggings. That's if they were ever to arrive. And some historians have argued persuasively that these women were not merely the passive victims then of male breadwinning fantasies, but partners in the business enterprise of seeking gold. So a bargain is struck between husband and wife as to how the household will continue to function in their absence. The gold rush widows lived the events and upheavals of the gold rushes themselves through correspondence, through press coverage, and the first-hand accounts of those returning from the gold fields. And you see a really great depiction here of a gold rush widow from the colony of Victoria by William Strutt, who creates loads of fantastic pencil and watercolor sketches of life in goldfield societies.
Steve, just jump in too for anyone in the audience that might have missed it. I'm sure if you think of any gold rush story or film or movie or Western, folks, you'll know the scene of the pretty lady walking on the boardwalk, and all the men will stick their head out the window. And if you look at the right to this picture, you'll see the opposite is happening, where men have become such a rare scene in Melbourne. You can see the man is walking on the right hand end, and all the women are sticking their head out the window and sort of gawking at this unusual person wandering down the street. So it's sort of aping that trope, I guess, that we have of the lady in the gold rush town is being reversed here with the man who's still in the city, who hasn't run off to the diggings.
Exactly. I mean, the final point then, I guess, that to move on to it, if Ben's happy, it will be. I think this was one of the most interesting things for me about this project. Was this Ben's already kind of trailed it. Was this idea of gold rush gateways then? So to zoom out back again from the rushes to the kind of global story that we were trying to tell. It really led me to rethink what the world looked like from a kind of Russia's perspective, and how the world would look if we mapped it from the gold rush's perspective. And the kind of central kind of location for me became the kind of gold rush gateways, be they kind of oceanic ones like San Francisco, Melbourne, Cape Town, Dunedin, or Vancouver, through which those migrants all kind of flowed, through which goods were transshipped over land or by water to the frontier where the extractions taken place. But the more you think about it, the more you can start to add other kind of gold rush gateways there. I mean, in inland interior ports, not riverine in all cases, such as Denver, Boise, Sacramento, and Stockton, often located near navigable rivers and at livable altitudes. Once the mines surrounding them are closed in the winter. Johannesburg in South Africa, which functions as an inland gateway thanks to the convergence of railways in that area, from Cape Town to the south west, Delagoa Bay to the southeast, and Durban also in that direction, that channel all this movement of goods and people into the gold mines. And smaller towns close to the mines themselves are also then plugged in into this kind of like global network then of gateways. And you can see that Ben showed some pictures just then of the phenomenal growth of Melbourne across that period. It goes, from a small town into a booming metropolis in a matter of 3 decades. Thanks to the specie and the investment that comes with gold. These places are important kind of transaction points where you find merchants, where you find the emigration agents, the entrepreneurs like Levi Strauss would be a good example in San Francisco. And then later the industrial giants that come to take over when the gold rushes move from alluvial to kind of capital intensive mining. You find the banks, the exchanges, the counting houses, the assayers, the telegraph offices, the post offices, branches of Western Union or Wells Fargo, news wires, but you also find the saloons, the boarding houses, the gambling dens, and the bordellos that sustain all of these people while they're in town. I think what was interesting too is how they accelerate demographic growth and urban growth in each of these cases, sometimes in quite surprising and vivid ways. So on the slide, you have a picture of the Niantic Hotel on Clay and Sansom, at the junction of Clay and Sansom Streets in San Francisco. And there's another, what looks like a warehouse next to it. But what they've done there is that all of those abandoned ships in the harbour, they've built out jetties to them, and they're just using them as storage sites or as hotels, and they're making use of the space. And so they're taking they're taking the sea to make the city, as it were, filling in the area between it with rubble and trash, and reclaiming all of that land. And that growth you can measure quite nicely in San Francisco. In 1848, it's home to just 800 people. That had grown to 20,000 by 1850, 50,000 a decade later. And the rate of in-migration, of course, is even higher. So all these individuals are passing through, possibly as many as 450,000 people between 1849 and 1860. When the gold rush first starts, there are just 135 houses and 12 stores to accommodate them, and then so quite quickly they have to reorganize all of that urban space, and they come up with innovative, interesting ways to do that. And one of them was to pull up the ships to shore or to build out the land to meet them. So one mining journalist noted in 1849 that in San Francisco, most of those ships have been entirely abandoned as sailors jumped ashore. And because the cost of lumber is so high, the city just expands to meet them. And so by 1857, 17 landings have been built out to those ships, which have been drawn up, their rigs taken off, and converted into saloons, into offices, and even into a prison in one case. And people even commented that the streets swayed noticeably as you walked along them. And some people fancifully call it the Venice of Pine, because of the kind of riverine, or like the aquatic nature, I guess, of street life in San Francisco. And you also see in these places a kind of a booming inter-gold rush trade, which I think is an interesting feature, and shows and is really how news spreads so quickly between these places, as surplus American wheat and flour makes its way to New South Wales, Victoria, where there are new rushes. It also brings rumours, it brings gossip, brings information that propel these rushers, these miners around the world, many of whom don't find their bonanza nugget and don't become rich. So they're constantly seeking that next gold field where they can strike it lucky. I think, Ben, if you want to pass over to some concluding thoughts at this point.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Ray. I guess, folks, I think we've given you a pretty good sense of the scope of the book there and what we've tried to do. I might as always, Steve and I bring a few extra slides just because these pictures are so fun to show. But I might jump ahead just to wrap up with. And I think one of the things that really fascinated us about this phenomenon is the way in which people really realize that they're living through a globe-changing moment. This is again from Punch magazine, the London satirical magazine that we mentioned before. And Punch, I guess, always saw itself as taking the kind of humorous but also kind of cutting view of what was going on in the news. So this idea that of the world being kind of tipped on its axis, that if this gold rush phenomenon continued, the Earth is sort of here with a giant bite taken out of it by the miners, but also tipping the globe off its axis, but also sort of tipping the course of world affairs off its axis. And then I think just to finish that sense, as Steve said, of the Klondike, that sort of last great moment at the end of the 19th century, where gold mining had sort of become self-referential. So, people would sing the song "The Days of '49." They would think about them as the inheritors of that tradition that started in California, and would see this last great chance of kind of escaping, all the sort of rigors of the industrial world. What a great. You might think of the parallels of buying a lottery ticket or something along those lines today. That chance to have that one great piece of luck that would liberate you from all the pressures that govern our day-to-day lives. And certainly by the end of the 19th century, there's this nostalgia associated with gold rushing. And you can see here the miners sort of kind of desperately pushing on ahead despite the vultures circling or at least surrounding him as he's desperately toiling away at the riverbed there in a very kind of 1849 type approach. So I guess it just remains to say thanks so much for letting us come along and talk today. As I said, this is a topic we love talking about, and I think one of the great things about speaking to audiences in different parts of the United States is I think obviously many American families have connections to this story at all different levels. And obviously the gold rushes were such a transformative event in attracting people from all parts of the States. And so for us, it's one of the reasons we love giving these talks is we always learn a new story or two every time we give a talk like this. So our thanks and a particular thanks to Ray for all her efforts organising us today. I know she's got a big day herself later on this afternoon, so we're very grateful.
Yes,
thanks, Ray.
I say Thank you guys so much. I know that we've had at least one question come through. So if anyone has questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Someone asked that they said that your book sounds fascinating and wanted to know if you had any historical fiction books on the gold rushes to recommend, if there are any that kind of stayed true to what it would have actually been like, or uh, maybe had a very romanticized version of what they would have been.
Oh, great
Thanks,
question.
Ray. What a great question. Steve, do you have a favorite Gold Rush book?
The last one I read was Eleanor Caton's The Luminaries,
Hmm.
which is kind of a murder mystery set in the New Zealand gold rushes. Um, but that I'm struggling now that you've asked. I'm really trying to rack my brains for the gold, like actual gold rush. It's
Yeah, I mean,
really really prominent in the movies.
Hmm.
Mm,
I would also go into that for the luminaries, folks. If you, but particularly if you're sitting there in Illinois and are wanting to learn a little bit about, as Steve says, I think New Zealand in some ways is not sort of doesn't register on our kind of historical consciousness in terms of its gold rushes in the same way that California or Australia do. But as Steve said, it's really fascinating because it's by the time you get to New Zealand, there's actually quite a bit of experience in gold rushing. So you have Californians turning up, you have Californians who've come here and then crossed to New Zealand. And the luminaries, there's also a very good audio book of it if you're a commuter like me. I think I got through it first commuting. So um, I think too the other I mean there are some wonderful if it's the stories of the gold rushes you're interested in, I mean, I suppose it's an area of history that's blessed also with some really wonderful historical work that's written in a very engaging narrative fashion as well. So I think Brands's Age of Gold is a wonderful, if you're wanting to sort of go through the story of the gold rush, and to capture the sort of narratives and the stories of the people, then The Age of Gold by H. Brands is a great sort of narrative history of the story.
Fantastic. I know for sure that, especially for us here in the States, a lot of our first contact with any sort of gold rush is the NFL 49ers. And
Of
so
course.
it's all, so it's always really great to just, I know for me personally, I didn't realize that so many miners kind of hopped around the Pacific. I just had this kind of assumption that they went out, west and probably did not strike gold and then kind of moseyed back home a little bit, sometimes with their tail between their legs, back to their mining widows. And to know that a lot of them had that gold fever that extended to getting on ships and traveling the Pacific is really fascinating, and definitely has expanded my worldview of what the gold rushes really do mean. And that definitely, I think more economists need to be studying historic gold rushes, and that would probably give them a lot of insights into how the world works today, or why it works the way it does today. I say, does anyone have any other kind of questions or comments that they would like to address to our two presenters?
I
I'll
should say,
give.
Ray, too, it's very early in the morning here, so hardly the time for it. But were we doing this talk at a slightly later time in Australia? So the Creswick, the town where I live, has an American hotel, which was actually the American Hotel is one of the pubs in town, which is kind of named in honor of the Americans. Ballarat, the city just up the road, had a New York hotel. Um, the presence of Americans at our the Eureka Stockade, which is a kind of key event in Australian history, has a very strong American Republican influence, and so certainly the presence of Americans and their influence in this part of of Australia is very important. I mean, there's a Denver about 45 minutes drive from here, so those place names I think kind of speak to the shared experience of these these stories. And you'll find Eldorados and various other kind of connections to that global story.
I say we had a comment that says a new look at an old story, the effect on Native peoples, women's work, and the growth of cities are not usually brought up. Thank you. So like as you said in your presentation, that's definitely a narrative that has been missing from this part of history. You definitely think of the very grizzled prospector is who comes to mind with this. Well, I will
think
say
too, Ray,
Oh, yeah.
sorry, I was just going to say on that question, as Steve said too, I think particularly for the story of women at the gold rush, there's the story of the women who traveled to the gold rush, which of course has not been fully explored, but also the really important story of the women who stay behind. And I think probably the parallel would be thinking about in wartime, histories of the home front, where we now know so much more about the experiences of women who had to stay behind if men went off to fight. We know about their lives and how they're changed by this changing arrangement. And I think we're kind of gradually getting to a point where gold rushers have that kind of experience. And if you read the letters home from a miner or from a mum or a sister or a wife who's back in the East Coast or wherever they are, that's really what it reminds me of. It reminds me of those letters between a soldier at the front and his family at home. And I think that sort of story is really starting to come to the fore as well.
I think it's that those other places are gold rush societies too. I think that probably grapple with that. That we think of it, gold rushers as planting new societies and those places as being particularly shaped by gold, but actually they've left somewhere, and that leaves an incredible mark on the places they are. So yeah, I found that fascinating. There's probably stuff scattered all over, even the UK, that is not considered in that light. And we don't think of the UK as a gold rush society, but so many of its people were leaving to travel the world. And famously, like Cornish miners were among that group. But yeah.
The exciting part of history is there's always new things to be discovered, and someone's on a box in someone's attic or in a small historical society. And so this has been fascinating, truly. Thank you so much. For those of you who are local to Lombard, we do have, as I said at the beginning, our newest exhibit on Charles Peck, our own local 49er. Will be opening up next week. So hopefully you guys all get a chance to come and see not only his attempts at finding gold, but really the treasures he brought back were his memories and his paintings that he did all throughout the rest of his life of these fantastic Western scenes. And as I said, that opens at the Sheldon Peck Homestead a week from today. It looks like we have no other questions or comments coming in. And so I just wanted to once again thank both of you for spending some of your evening, some of your very early morning with us and sharing this wonderful topic with us. Truly, thank you so much. And I hope that everyone else who has joined us has a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you guys all again very soon.